welcome back. It is good to see everyone again. Before we get to our next panel, I want to take a moment to acknowledge a few of our student leaders here at the law school. First, the Colorado Technology Law Journal, which Dean Innes mentioned, has long published scholarship coming out of this conference, including the work of tomorrow's keynote speaker, Tim Wu, on net neutrality, published in the journal. FCC Chair Michael Powell's famous For Freedom speech, and a wide range of other scholarship. We're really proud of this year's board for all of their hard work, and I wanted to recognize the leadership and dedication of the journal's outgoing editor-in-chief, Cassandra Pankey, and to congratulate the journal's newly elected incoming editor-in-chief, Marlena Pinto. Please join me in giving them a hand. Second, I'd like to acknowledge the Silicon Flatiron Student Group, which I learned has 143 members. We've only got something like 500 and some students here at the law school. So a really amazing student group, and several of the members of the leadership are here with us. So I wanted to acknowledge the president, Maddie Carr, the secretary, Isabel Dean, the treasurer, E.B. Bollandonk, and the program director, Sydney Weigert. Thank you guys for all you do. That, I am delighted to hand off to our next panel. This is an experiment I am so excited for. We are going to turn the tables on some of our favorite technology, law, and policy journalists. And with that, happy to hand things over to my colleague, Casey Fiesler, who's the Associate Chair of Graduate Studies and Associate Professor in the Information Science Department. Casey.
Thank you, Blake. Hello, everyone. So the internet's midlife crisis. A lot of us have watched the internet grow up. Most people, however, do not read law review articles or policy briefs. So we have a group of folks here who I think are an interesting example of people with a sort of bird's eye view of the technology and internet policy landscape. So I'm going to, well actually, here let me briefly introduce folks. We have Steve Heuser, who is the global technology editor at POLITICO, Cristiano Lima, who is a reporter at the Washington Post, and Addie Robertson, who is a senior reporter at the Verge. So feel free to say more about yourselves as we start off here, but I would like to start with a pretty simple question. Nice to be able to ask journalists questions for once. What do you think is one of the most important issues in technology or internet policy right now that people should be thinking about?
Would you like me to start this?
Sure, yes.
Right, I'm Steve Heuser from POLITICO. I'm relatively new to the tech policy landscape, so I don't speak with like Vatic authority on these topics. I'm speaking a little bit as a citizen, an editor, and an interested reader. I don't think there's a number of things obviously that are huge issues right now, but I feel like the one thing that might have a chance of successfully getting litigated in the regulatory and sort of political environment is the data privacy stuff we've been talking about. I work for POLITICO, which is a very pragmatic organization that covers like real world debates. In the wide range of topics that we could be addressing, and some of the political theatrics that we are going to see this week when it comes to Congress and oversight and so forth. The one that seems to have a lot of like granular interest right now, actual pathways developing for things to happen, is sort of data regulation, data privacy, data ownership questions. It's happening at the state level, as everybody here knows. Whether or not there's real progress at the federal level, it's hard to say. But I feel like that's, if we're paying attention to one thing right now in that environment, it's that. I mean, I'm sorry, competition and antitrust is not trivial right now, but I would say that the data one is very interesting.
Yeah, so I won't speak to importance. I think all these things are important, but in terms of some of the most striking changes that we've seen over the past decade, I think whereas an issue like privacy has been kind of a slow build, right? I mean, the Obama administration had the Privacy Bill of Rights in 2012, and we've seen action trickle to the States and in Europe. I think something like competition and antitrust has been really interesting because that has been sort of a more sudden surge, and certainly we're seeing that translate in some of the enforcement actions, which have been getting increasingly aggressive. But I think it's also translated a little bit in interesting ways in terms of the politics. I think the privacy debate, it's mostly still debated along partisan lines, whereas the antitrust and competition discussion is much more fluid. And there's a lot of alliances between the populist right, the populist left. And so seeing how those progress and the ability that they're able to impact change is something that I've been watching very closely.
I think that at a really broad level, the thing that I really wish more people would focus on is the internet outside quote unquote big tech. That there's a lot of focus on the idea that we need to rein in, it's mostly Facebook, Google, Amazon, maybe Twitter, that I think that first of all, when you're trying to make policy changes, this ends up really neglecting the impact that any of these changes would have on, at the large scale, something like an infrastructure provider, like a hosting company that hosts a newspaper, or at the small end, a community like a small Mastodon instance, or a subreddit that has a small group of moderators who are vulnerable to lawsuits if Section 230 gets reformed. I think that at the same time, there are also a lot of bad actors outside the ecosystem of these really large, very heavily algorithmic suggestion-oriented social platforms, that there are a lot of huge harassment issues with, say, small forums, that a lot of spam and a lot of sort of financial scams and a lot of, honestly, violence takes place just on basic mass communication platforms. That WhatsApp is not an algorithmic platform. It's not even something that, even though it's owned by Meta, is often considered big tech. It is also a thing that has produced lynchings in India. So I really wish that while people were talking about a lot of companies that have a lot of power and are very important, that we would try to figure out how these things impact the internet as a whole and how we can foster parts of the internet outside these ecosystems that we all agree have these huge problems.
Great, thank you. So Cristiano talked a little bit about some of the changes that we've seen, and I also think something that Addie points out, and that I think we've heard a lot about already, is that when we talk about the internet, especially policy issues, there's a lot of focus on the negative. Now, if you go to Google News and you type in Facebook or AI or privacy, you're going to see more bad stories than good. And I think a lot of this discussion about the internet's midlife crisis kind of gets at that. So I'm curious how you think we've gotten to where we are. Like, do you think that's a valid kind of change that we've seen, or are we just noticing it for certain reasons? But how did we get here? Any thoughts?
I would ask Adi that question.
I think that there are sort of two issues. The first issue is that the internet, as it was created, in a lot of ways was not designed for living on. It was designed for going on and being a kind of second space and having fun. And as a result, a lot of the infrastructure that was needed for a world where we couldn't leave the internet was never really built, including a lot of privacy issues and sort of other basic consumer protection issues. I think the other issue is that really everything outside the internet eroded. There's a lot of focus on, say, the effect that big tech platforms are having on kids. But part of the reason it's having these effects is because there are increasingly fewer other spaces for kids to be. And it's increasingly difficult to get childcare that's not just a screen. And so I think that we saw sort of the systematic breakdown and corruption of everything outside the internet, while the internet itself wasn't really built up to support the weight that we ended up putting on it.
So a part of your question is talking about scrutiny, and so I'll talk about sort of political scrutiny and how we got here. I mean, a couple of phrases that I've heard from lawmakers a lot on the Hill in terms of the past decade is that, you know, the tech industry used to be the golden goose, but lawmakers have come to see it as the Wild West. And so there's this sense that there hadn't been enough scrutiny of practices across the industry. And I think 2016 was really a turning point with Cambridge Analytica, with, of course, Russian interference on social media, where lawmakers started paying a lot more attention to this. And so you saw that suddenly surge. And I think part of what we're seeing is that scrutiny running into the hurdles of our bureaucracy and sort of policymakers struggling with trying to turn their concerns into constructive action, dealing with all the hurdles on the Hill, at agency level in the courts. And so I think that's part of why what you're saying is that there's this built up resentment and frustration, but there's also been hurdles to action and to change. And so I think that sort of compounds that problem.
Yeah, I mean, I look at the audience here and I see there's people who are OGs and have been doing this for a long time and kind of have followed the whole debate. And then I see a set of people who are students and are becoming part of the debate, right? And are preparing to enter the world that like our last panel is living in right now. And it's for the second set of people, it's nearly impossible to even imagine this. But like, you know, in 2011, like Barack Obama, the president of the United States, went to Facebook and held like an hour-long town hall with Mark Zuckerberg. And in preparation for this event, I actually went back and watched it on YouTube. And I recommend this because he was the coolest president, and like he went and literally sat next to Zuckerberg, and the two of them shared, had microphones, and they kind of broed out. And Obama bragged about how he made Zuckerberg wear a tie for the first time, and Zuckerberg's like the second time. And then like they both took their coats off, and I'm like, oh my God, this is 11 years ago or 12, it's unthinkable in today's political environment. And as Cristiano was saying, like a set of things, right? Cambridge Analytica, which incensed people on the left, and the sort of earlier scandal about Facebook demoting conservative content, which broke a couple of years ago, and this is in the mid-2010s, right? Like incensed the right. And so basically, suddenly big tech has genuine political enemies. And it completely transformed the debate, and it made the conversation we're having here even possible, right? Like out of here, like, well, these are the fundamental flaws that are living inside these platforms that we now live on, and like the only reason we're talking about that is because we went through a 2-year period in which everyone realized they could hate big tech, and it could be politically incredibly productive to hate big tech, and they can't do anything about it, as Cristiano said, for Politico reasons, but hating it is like great politics, and that's kind of the moment we're in.
Yeah, so speaking of today's political environment or hurdles on the Hill, this also is like a global policy issue. What is your perspective on the battle for power right now in this space, and how do you think that is impacting policy? Who wants to start?
I think it depends on, there are so many axes of the battle for power. You mentioned global, and so I think that right now there's kind of a question about what countries the internet is going to be for, because for a long time there was this sense that whoever made the most restrictive rules was going to kind of get the platforms to work to whatever they had created. In the US, it was whatever California does sets the standard for what internet law is. And I think that that's kind of broken down in recent years. I think we're kind of trying to we're seeing these companies try to tailor their services to a specific country or a specific region. And I think that there's gonna be a lot of fighting over whether that continues to be sustainable, or whether we end up having countries that are trying to push these platforms to work the same everywhere, or whether we're going to have I forget who coined the term, the splinter net, which is that you end up increasingly just having services that only work in one place. And so there's a balance of power, but that balance of power is just that the internet doesn't work the same way anymore.
Yes, I mean, if you're looking at sort of the broader ecosystem, as Eddie was alluding to, certainly there, at the global level, there's questions about like fragmentation of the web. There's also this tug of war between, Western values and more restrictive countries, as you were alluding to, authoritarian nations sort of cracking down on the internet, and sort of what the future of that will be. And that's a bit of the subtext also of a lot of the policy discussions happening in Washington, is like, to what extent do we want to kneecap our own companies as they're competing with companies overseas? In terms of, if your thought of what the central theater is, as Senator Bennett was talking about earlier, is this tug of war between the largest tech companies and regulators, then I think you'd say that the largest tech companies are doing fairly well. I mean, in the US, there's not a privacy law. There have not been significant updates of antitrust law. Some of the competition antitrust lawsuits are running into hurdles in the courts. We just saw with the Facebook FTC decision. And so in the US, there's a lot of challenges to those efforts to bring regulation into the digital age. Yeah, but you know, also I'd be remiss to not say that some of the most significant policy making happening it seems to be in Europe, and I think time will tell how successful those efforts will be.
Yeah, I feel like that's sort of a buried, I mean, we've talked about it here, but that's definitely a buried aspect of the power dynamic. At least it's off the radar for a lot of people in the US, which is to the extent to which the battle to control tech or to regulate tech in some way is being waged sort of between DC and Brussels, and then like California and Colorado, right, who have like meaningful state regulations. And the tech companies don't know right now who they need to really worry about the most. And they're sending a lot of lobbying money to Europe right now. We have a big office in Brussels, and the reason Politico has a big office in Brussels is for this exact reason, which is that like the European Union is like a really serious regulatory body that big companies have to think a lot about, and the tech universe is getting more and more ambitious. And so the sort of de facto battle to figure out who's going to write the rules is being waged on the regulatory side, while the bigger one between like the tech industry and the regulators are also is been joined.
And I think a lot of this is really complex too. I mean, it's, you know, the types of topics that were coming up in the last panel, for example, I think there are a lot of things that the average person on the street wouldn't necessarily know about. So as folks who do a lot of translational work, what are some things that you think in this space and sort of internet tech policy are challenging for the average person to understand, and how might that be impacting public opinion or how people are using technology or these kinds of political battles that we're seeing?
I think that one thing that I kind of alluded to earlier that's really hard for a lot of people to understand is how many of the things they think they hate about big tech are actually things that huge numbers of companies, including many that we don't associate with the internet, are doing. That if you're upset about algorithms, one of the things maybe you should be upset about is credit agencies that are using these really arcane, opaque systems to decide effectively who gets jobs or who gets houses. And I think that like the DMV is selling your data. There are all of these other platforms that really have a huge impact on people's lives. That I think that when people think about a thing they really don't like, some company they don't like doing, I really wish they would take a more holistic view of what is the actual problem and who is contributing to that problem. And then that's also kind of how you figure out how to solve it in a way that's not just we find somebody who's bad that we don't like and we punish them and we don't worry about what the fallout to anybody else would be.
Probably the thing that is hardest to convey and write about is Section 230, platform regulation, online harms, the intersection with the First Amendment. And I mean, these are things that get conflated a lot by our public officials and are discussed sometimes interchangeably. And I mean, but there's also like, as we've heard today, there's a lot of concern about how platforms are impacting kids. I get perhaps the most interest when I write things related to kids. And so there's a lot of like public, and it's also something that's very visceral. A lot of people here in the room and around the country, of course, have children, are on social media themselves. And so it's something that everyone has access to, but understanding sort of how the legal mechanisms work, I think is difficult. Whereas something like competition, you know, the consumer welfare standard, these are things that are a lot more opaque to consumers, where there's not sort of they can't necessarily understand it quite as viscerally.
I feel like we promised not to talk about actual journalism, but just use our sort of experience as journalists as like a lens onto the world that we're talking about here, which I think is the correct approach. And it's the kind of thing I tell people all the time on panels, like very gently, like I don't actually care what you do, I care what you know. But you know, in my little universe, right, we write for a couple different sets of people when we talk about the public awareness, right? And one set of people is highly specialized and they follow this stuff. And for them, this conversation is very interesting. The set of people that we have here is like, they're people you need to know what they are saying and thinking. And there's a second set of people, and we actually write for them, and you guys, the Post, write for them more, right? Which is like the general public, right? And people, like, none of this would make any sense to a regular person. Like, nothing we're talking about here would make any sense. Like, the idea that, you know, these specific data flows have to be administered by this particular committee, and like, if you staff it this way, then one thing happens if you do this other way, and the main thing that matters, and they don't need to know this. I'm not arguing that like the average citizen needs to be informed at that level about how their government works. The thing they don't get, and the thing that I think is important about this, is that a very large number of people can agree that something has to be done. And a very large number of experts can even agree, even across party lines, right, can agree on like sensible pathways to achieve those things. And then nothing will happen, period. And that's politics, right? And that is the voters' fault. And the reason it is because they don't care enough about these individual issues to hold their elected officials accountable to this stuff. They care about other stuff, right? They care about shooting down the Chinese spy balloon / weather thing, or, you know, whatever it is, the issue of the day. And that tends to be what people are responsive to. And so people aren't responsive enough to even very, very important issues like this to hold people accountable. If that doesn't happen at the electoral level, then there's no political pathway or no political impetus for this stuff to happen. And I would say, like, if regular people need to understand stuff, it's that. It's like if they care enough about this, then they have to care enough about it to like hold officials accountable for doing something rather than just kind of like yelling about it and being excited there's a hearing where the Twitter executives get flamed or whatever happens.
If I can add something to that really quick. Yeah, I mean, I get sent a lot of like surveys from interest groups, industry groups, saying like, oh, here we found that, you know, 75% of voters would support there being like federal privacy protections. I don't get a lot of surveys saying this is a top 5 issue for voters. And I think so, as Steve was alluding to, it can be politically beneficial to attack the tech giants, the industry, but it's certainly very difficult for the public to have enough visibility in terms of what the policy making actually looks like to try to hold their feet to the fire when they're trying to execute something that's going to actually help.
And yeah, Cristiano, I think you were also completely right about Section 230. As an add-on, I think a lot of people in the US do not understand the First Amendment at all or how it relates to Section 230. There are a lot of people who believe that Section 230 is going to just ban everything they don't like because they don't understand that it applies to illegal content. And so, yeah, it's incredibly confusing and difficult and frustrating.
Yeah, I will say the only time that I've ever gotten actual hate emails in my inbox was when I explained the First Amendment on local news, very simplistically. And you know, so there's a complexity of some of these policy issues, and I would like to think that most of our policymakers understand Section 230, for example, but there's also the complexity of a lot of the technology that we're talking about here, right? And I'm glad that we have interns feeding Congress people Taylor Swift lyrics. But I also think, you know, that there might be some topics that not all of our policymakers or regulators have a great sort of technical understanding of. So I'm wondering if there are any of these things that you think that like policymakers might be struggling to understand too from the more technical perspective.
So I don't know if it's a lack of comprehension, but something Addie was alluding to earlier is like, as we've been talking about, a lot of the rhetoric is targeted at the largest companies, but a lot of the policy making, especially legislation on Section 230, is going to impact a lot more companies than what they're talking about when they're doing some speeches. And I feel like that's something that gets lost at times in the discourse.
I think that a lot of members of Congress, for instance, know a lot more about the internet than maybe they let on. But I think one of the things that is persistently frustrating for me is that I think that bipartisanship doesn't work if the policy solution you've crafted involves two parties that are both trying to get opposite things out of the same piece of legislation. That I think you're not going to get a good Section 230 reform bill if it is simultaneously requiring companies to take everything down and leave everything up. That's just not possible.
There's an interesting argument that bipartisanship is totally overrated, right? And that issues only move when they become radically partisan. And then a party gets like full control of that and just runs the damn thing through, right? And that's like, everyone loves to wreath themselves in bipartisanship, but like, I don't know, like I'm sort of now getting partial to the argument that things just have to become super partisan if anything's gonna happen. And then the other side complains about it for a whole generation and that's who screwed it up. But like, that's a possible, like the thing you're saying is completely true, right? Like, and that suggests that like in this environment, you know, that we're in right now, like bipartisanship is like a little bit of a canard if you're thinking about actually doing regulation. I'm sorry, I actually want to totally endorse the thing you just said, which is like a rare moment of being nice to politicians. People understand a lot of stuff. Like, I'm guilty of this, right? In 2015, like I sent a reporter through Capitol Hill with a microphone and an iPhone, asking members of Congress what the Internet of Things was. And haha, a lot of them didn't know, surprise. I mean, it was like new, we didn't know what it was. But but like actually, you know, who's on the staff? Who's on like, what is, Al Franken's staff, like Alvaro Bedoya was like doing data prep. And like, that dude is really smart. Like there were a lot of people on the Hill who were very, very bright. And like people doing policy, like 15 years ago, I was at the Boston Globe's ideas section. And like, if you knew who Tim Wu was, like you were cool because it was like it was like obscure insider knowledge, but you were kind of new. Like, okay, and now I'm like, and now he's like a regulatory celebrity, and I'm like, I am sitting next to Tim Wu, and like that's like actually that's a meaningful. I mean, the amount of knowledge that is actually exists in like these DC and Dean staffs and stuff is pretty. That's not the problem, actually.
And I think it's gotten a lot more specialized too. I mean, I think a lot of us groan when there's like another tech hearing, and some are a lot more targeted and refined than others. But I mean, there have been like investigations, the House antitrust investigation. They were very substantive, very focused, and you could see that the lawmakers on the panel over time developed like very specialized expertise. And then they become the thought leaders in terms of what reforms look like. Because I mean, you might be able to tell that I focus a lot on Capitol Hill, but it's just a matter of fact that a lot of these discussions happen at the committee level, and they are the ones with specialized expertise, and then sort of other lawmakers will take their cue from party leadership about when that idea that's generated at the committee level is ready to move up. So yeah, if you walk around Capitol Hill and you're asking about IoT, like you're going to get some people that don't know, but I do think that it's gotten a lot more refined over the years.
We had like a panel last year with like Cynthia Lummis in Wyoming and Kristen Gillibrand in New York, like talked about crypto, right? And they have like introducing a bill, it's a bipartisan bill to regulate crypto. They were really good at it. Like we had reporters grilling them on stuff and they knew their stuff, or at least as much as you need to know if you're a senator, like, which is a bunch. It's not, you don't need to know infinite things about the Satoshi Nakamoto, right? Like, you blog post, you just need to know like how this is supposed to get regulated, and they were really good at it. And they introduced a bipartisan bill, and like, has anything happened? No, and that is the thing. Honestly feel like that's the thing that you just need to talk about if you're worrying about this stuff in Washington.
And I think that Addie brought up something really important. Is like, how do we take everything down and keep everything up at the same time? So are there other types of things that you think are like major trade-offs that are having to happen right now or are being discussed that you think are important?
I think for me, one of the big trade-offs is between something like antitrust and like trying to limit the power of really large platforms, and the fact that that ends up often creating privacy and security trade-offs at the smaller scale. There was a speaker's dinner last night, and we were talking about the fact that if, say, you want to let smaller companies get access to the data that say Facebook has, or you want to be able to tie into Facebook's network and let people move their information off that service, that then you also end up getting into a sort of Cambridge Analytica situation where you are creating this huge ticking time bomb potentially if a bad actor uses that system. And so I think it's really, really difficult to simultaneously limit the power of these gatekeepers and to deal with the fact that gatekeepers often, like, they keep things out. They do actually serve a purpose, and that you have to find a way to deal with the fallout created by removing that structure.
I can move on.
Well, so I would also say that I think that's a great point, and certainly that's something we've heard a lot in terms of the debate over antitrust legislation on Capitol Hill. There's also been friction between how competition and antitrust standards might intersect with content moderation. We saw this come up a lot in the debate around ICOA. The Open App Markets Act, there were a lot of advocacy groups expressing concern about how these regulations that are meant to sort of rein in alleged anti-competitive abuses by these companies might also impact their content moderation efforts and their efforts to crack down on things like hate speech and misinformation. So I think we're increasingly seeing these different efforts sort of grind against each other, and lawmakers trying to find, and policymakers trying to find the right balance between them.
So this is actually going to be my last question before I open it up to others, and that is, given all of this, if we're in the internet's midlife crisis as it gets older, where do you think we're going next? Like, what do you think are going to be the next big topics? And I will give you a bonus question, which is, if you like, give us a headline that you think you might write in, say, 5 years.
I'll spec and start. So it's literally practically illegal for people in my jobs like mine to prognosticate, right? We're not supposed to be pundits but I'd say the headline is obviously Congress still stuck on, I promise to you, if I am in this job in 5 years, I will publish a story that has that headline. I'll email it to you. Because I am an editor, I can actually write the headline and just, I will do that. So that's real. The one thing, broadly speaking though, like I'm cynical about, potential, maybe cynical is the wrong word. I'm skeptic. I share the skepticism of the earlier panelists and the potential for the current Congress to sort of move on a lot of these issues, but it is a real thing that we are seeing the development of a thicker regulatory apparatus around an industry that is used to skating on this stuff, right? Like I can tell you, this is like benefits of being inside a newsroom. It's like the energy business, the pharmaceutical industry. These are relatively high margin, very profitable businesses, full of smart, innovative people that have been living for a really long time with an extremely thick regulatory layer. Kind of works, right? American pharma is still, last I checked, like by far the global leader in this. And tech industry has been the massive beneficiary of like federal largesse in many ways, continuing, right? We're like sloshing money into infrastructure, like literally, and proud of it, without any particular oversight or expectation of responsibilities. That's changing. That is genuinely changing. The conversations we're having now, they just weren't happening like 10 years ago outside of like really like granular events. And so we are watching this happen, and maybe it's happening at the agencies at this point. Agencies are getting smarter, they're working with Europeans, the states are doing this, but the layer is thickening, the amount of regulatory, there's a trade-off between that and innovation. That's a real trade-off, but it's not unreasonable to expect that like an industry of this scale is gonna, in 5 years, be dealing with something not at the, energy industry level, but like something it hasn't had to deal with before.
So I'm going to cheat a little bit and use a past headline, and actually one that was published in Politico when I used to work there. I did not write it.
Your story, Cristiano? Okay.
Yes, it was my story, yeah. But an editor wrote, I did not write it, but echoing what Steve said, I think the headline was, Zuckerberg was testifying, I think it was around when they were trying to launch their own, the Libra, what was the older name?
The cryptocurrency.
Yeah. But the headline was like, Congress whacks big tech, but don't expect much action. And we kind of had a running joke that this was like a headline that we could maybe repurpose over time.
That's weird. We ran that story this fall about something
there you
completely
go.
different.
I know, I did see that, I flagged that. So there's that, but seriously, one thing that's clear is like states are acting, states are moving. We've already seen like dozens of privacy bills introduced, like so it, and from speaking to experts, like they expect, every year we'll see more and more of those actually converted. We're seeing more and more states take up potential app store legislation. I think this could be a big year for children's safety standards at the safety level. And so I think that's something that's going to continue, and it'll, lead to more of these questions about fragmentation, patchwork that we've been talking about for years. So I certainly see that sort of in the short term as one of the biggest stories that we'll continue tracking. But then also, of course, a lot of the regulators, particularly in the US, they're just starting to gear up with a lot of these antitrust lawsuits, competition lawsuits, and we're going to be tracking those battles at the court level for years. Eventually with the DSA and DMA coming into force, I think we're going to see some likely significant enforcement actions out of that we'll be tracking the effectiveness and comparing it to the enforcement of GDPR, for example. So I think those are some of the things that we'll be watching.
My headline is a little bit hyper-specific, which is I don't know if the agency is the FTC or the DOJ, but one of them is investigating collusion in fixing the data sets for artificial intelligence, which is definitely probably going to happen because if you can get an AI that recommends Amazon products, 95% of the time, Amazon is going to do that. But more generally, I think one of the most interesting things of the past few years has been the understanding that a lot of policy now is happening at this really hyper, and the internet now is happening at this hyper community level, that Elon Musk buying Twitter has done some really interesting things for, say, people realizing they can run their own social networks. States are coming up with, and very local governments are coming up with these rules that are going to restrict access to what libraries can stock. And so I think a lot of what we're going to be covering in the next years are probably going to be things that are happening at a scale way, way smaller than big tech, even though it still has a huge impact on what those people can do.
Well, and being in my 8th year of Silicon Flatirons, I know the rules. Do we have a question from a student for our panelists? I see someone over here.
Thank you, Paul, for this great talk. My question is, so like you guys are predicting that everything will be happening on a more local level. Do you think the ramifications or implications of these local rules, laws will somehow push this big tech to then kind of push for like a federal law to kind of preempt or I don't know, maybe it will be like a floor, maybe it will be a ceiling of some sort, but that would then somehow speed up of passing a federal privacy law?
Yeah, I mean, that's been happening, right? Like we've been hearing from industry groups for a couple of years, after CCPA was passed, that the patchwork is going to make it unsustainable for businesses big and small, particularly potentially for smaller businesses. And so, yeah, but I could also see that argument be made as well if we start to see more states take up, children's online safety standards, or they start to take up app store legislation, or they start to take up digital taxation. I think you're going to see that definitely be one of the main criticisms, and will hasten calls for action at the national level.
Oh gosh, so many questions. How about over here?
Because I'm sitting next to Tim Wu, which makes me
I was gonna let you guys choose
So not
instead of
you.
me picking one of you.
So Paul, you didn't say much about courts, and 2 weeks from Tuesday, right? I'm curious if you all think Gonzalez is an opportunity to educate the general public, or instead you fear that it's just going to become like well-funded op-eds on both sides, or if it'd be a telling answer if you said that's not my beat, like I don't care about courts, or I don't do courts, or that's someone else. So what do you think about Gonzalez coming up?
I am going to be covering Gonzalez closely, but I've had increasing problems trying to explain court cases to people because I don't feel like I understand what courts are doing anymore. I used to try to be able to explain, well, usually court cases, like all these precedents mean this, and that means we're likely going to be able to see this. And then I think maybe it was the Texas Fifth Circuit decision on the Texas social media law that really just kind of broke me. Look, the Supreme Court makes the rules. How am I supposed to tell people what courts are going to do if it's just going to throw everything out?
I think the courts are huge. We're watching that case very closely. So I write a newsletter, the Tech 202 subscribe. I did like a series of previews like the first week of the year, and the first one I did was on the Supreme Court case because I think that might be the biggest story of the year. But I don't think it's limited to that. I mean, there's already a challenge to the California age-appropriate design code. I think, as policymakers start to actually get more rules on the books, how those are actually litigated in the courts, I think is going to be defining as far as tech stories go.
A lot of pressure all of a sudden. I have a question about coverage. I was I'm just coming out of the White House, and I have to say, in the job, I was impressed very often at the amount of access that the reporters got and things that they covered. But one thing I thought got less attention than I thought it might was less the question of who introduced the bill, and I'm talking about congressional coverage in particular, and more effort to ferret out who killed it. You know, everything, there's this kind of like a lot of passive voice. You know, I spent a lot of time wondering why, you know, Congress doesn't do, I think we're all interested in something supported by 95% of the public, something like children's safety online or something like that. There's Bill. You know, I don't think anyone would have voted against it. And, you know, there is quite an amount of coverage of stuff getting started, but that sort of almost question of who really, in the end, killed it, I think is very rarely covered. Now, I know that it's not exactly like senators are volunteering to give an interview about why I killed child online safety. But you know, I started thinking maybe they need to wear body cams or something. but that is sometimes something that they get away with frequency. I mean, I think probably it was mostly Pallone who killed that bill. I never saw it reported. I think McConnell had a big role in it, not very much reported. Just kind of that, and then it always comes, well, Congress didn't do something. Congress, and so I wonder if that is something you try to do and it's impossible, or any comment on that question?
Didn't Ken Buck throw McConnell under the bus in your newsletter?
Yes. Yes, but he said.
That didn't work out very well for him, did it?
Yeah. But he said they were being pressured by industry, like Republicans are being. No, I think that's a terrific point. I think that is a prime target always. And I think that's something that we try to get to the bottom of. Of course, it's a harder thing to report out, to get the data points, to be able to show it. I mean, it's easy to show groups spending X amount of lobbying. But I think sometimes like causality is something that's very tricky in journalism, right? So I think we try to find data points that we think, you know, reveal a story. But it can be hard unless you have just extremely good intel to actually draw that causal link.
So that's like one of those questions where it's like, you're asking why we don't do it, but you're really saying, I would like you to do more of this. And like, so to that effect, like, I'll give you my cell phone number. You will text me. That is how Washington works. And I will share that with my reporters who will think I'm a badass when that happens. But speaking of like, as an editor, you're making excuses for or taking credit for the work of your reporters when you answer a question like this. So that's with that caveat, like, it's a really hard question to answer a lot of the time. You do see hints and allusions to it if you kind of read carefully and kind of pick up these gossipy things. And another really hard one is who stuck this thing in, right? Like you'll read these bills and, you know, 1 bazillion pieces of legislation show up at 10:14 p.m. and everybody has to read it really quickly. And then you're like, oh my God, like, you know, Section 8, like chapter, like has this crazy thing. And who put that in? And that's really hard to do, actually. We are super curious about it, and we ask this question a lot. But it's actually like the legislative process in the United States of America is like, you know, anybody can walk into Congress. Reporters can hop on the elevator, you know, with an elected representative, but like literally nobody knows. Nobody and there's some really crazy language that showed up in some of the bills that were moving at the very end of the year, and we were literally trying to answer these questions. And we couldn't figure out whether it had accidentally been left in from an earlier draft by a junior staffer or if it had deliberately been inserted at the last second. And I mean, you can't always answer these questions. And these are really important, like multi-billion-dollar federal bills. I would argue for more transparency in this process.
So I think we have time for one more question. We have one over here.
Thank you. This is a rare opportunity that we don't often get. So thank you. I'm Christopher Yu at the University of Pennsylvania. At least one person has told, on a previous panel, they said there's very little positive about big tech these days. And I'm curious about how the dynamics work in the newsroom on reporting. And I'm going to give you an anecdote. One person had told me that they couldn't get certain stories through because of an editorial message where the negative message was selling stronger. Do you think this is, I mean, I don't mean to generalize, I don't know how general it is. And I'd love to get your reactions. Does this dynamic happen? Is this a concern in how the reporting comes out?
I feel like the answer for me might be very different from the answer of you two, because we're kind of in an unusual position where we might be critical of a lot of these companies. We're also actively reviewing their products. We're covering them as consumer goods. And so to some extent, unless we, I don't know, declared we're never reviewing an Amazon device or we're never reviewing an Apple phone again, there's probably going to be something positive no matter what. I think that also the consensus in a lot of places was that the tech like the sort of enthusiast press was very uncritical of quote unquote big tech for a long time. But I don't know, I think there's this kind of constant balancing act where we're trying to discuss these things as things that people use every day constantly, and we're weighing the costs and benefits of, and we're also treating them like these entities that are having these very large arcane effects on politics. And I think that maybe the difficulty is trying to bridge that gap.
I mean, I'll say this is not a criticism that's unique to like tech journalism, right? I mean, I think you hear a lot like, oh, local news, like they're always covering like the car crashes and the robberies. And there's this sense that as reporters, we sort of fixate on the negative. I mean, from my vantage point, I focus largely on what policymakers, what regulators, what legislators are doing. And as we've been talking about, a lot of the tenor of that discussion right now is not particularly positive. And so from my vantage point, I think that might be why that's reflected to a degree in the coverage. But I think that's a legitimate criticism, and perhaps there are times where it's you know, policymakers and journalists have overcorrected.
Yeah, I don't ask my people to cover things a particular way, and I don't expect them to be harder on big tech than they are, or harder on Democrats than Republicans or anything like that. But you hear rumors like, oh yeah, such and such a place, you know, this reporter actually left because they just felt like they were being dragged, and I don't even know if I believe, like, I can see that in like patterns of coverage, but to me, a lot of it is explainable by like journalism as a culture. Like, people do this job because they think some stuff is wrong out there and they want to find out what it is and tell people about it, right? It's kind of like, it's not crusading, but it's sort of people who like, they're curious because they think stuff could be better, right? And so like the general tenor of coverage tends of like sort of not like product reviews, but like serious, you know, like, you know, digging does tend toward like something is wrong, right? Something is wrong with the process in Congress, something is wrong at Facebook, and we kind of want to reveal it. So there's a self-selection. I don't think it's necessarily programmatic or like you're directed to cover things a certain way. But I'm only speaking from the places I've worked where I haven't had that experience.
So I was very excited to see all of those raised hands, and despite not being able to get to all of the questions, I believe we are going into lunch. So I would encourage folks to find our panelists to have more of a chat, and thank you very much for the excellent questions and for the attention.